There are already plans for human settlements on the moon, but there are several legal questions that still need to be resolved, including who owns the moon. In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we are joined by professor and space lawyer Frans van der Dunk to address some of these questions, including whether Artemis Accord is going to help or hurt the Outerspace Treaty. Our guest today is Professor Frans van der Dunk, and he has a really impressive bio, long bio. I'm going to give you a little sort of like dose of sort of like a flavor of that, but it's much more than that. He's a professor, Harvey and Susan Perlman alumni, and Atma professor of space law at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He got his PhD in international space law in 1998 from University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He has received a number of awards, including Distinguished Service Award of the International Institute of Space Law of the International Astronautical Federation, Social Science Award of the International Academy of Astronautics, and a lot more. He has written more than 180 articles that have been published, and many of those are available on his website, and I'm going to provide a link in the description, because if you want to learn more about space law and these issues, then you can have access to that. He also published the first comprehensive Handbook of Space Law with Edward Elgar Publishing, and then in 2018, a research collection under the title International Space Law with the same publisher. In addition, he has served as an advisor to the Dutch government, European Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, the United Arab Emirates Space Agency, the Saudi Space Agency, etc., etc. So basically, he knows what he's talking about, and so that's why we'll be talking to him. And he also is the owner of Black Holes, a consultancy company for space law and policy. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we will get to the moon, but I thought we will start with a little bit farther away. And partly because people think about, even thinking about the moon, they think, oh, it's so much in the future. Why are we worrying about it? And I think that's mistaken. But I wanted to talk about Elon Musk and Mars because you have commented on that as well, because he has laid some plans regarding territorial or ownership of what's going to happen on Mars. And in particular, if I can read that, this is a couple of years ago when people found out that in his Starlink service agreement, which normally people just sign up, okay, yes, it turns out it actually mentioned about Mars, and he says, that accordingly disputes, this is on Mars, any disputes about Mars will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of Martian settlement. This is in the Starlink agreement here. So what is going on here? And should we, is it just fiction? Should we take him seriously? What should we do?
That's a great question. I'm going to give you a couple of initial answers. First of all, from the legal side, people should be aware that any astronomer will tell you that the moon and Mars are totally different types of bodies, but legally speaking, they're in the same basket. So if we talk about things like ownership over the moon or Mars, that is basically the same legal question. Now, coming to Elon Musk. Part of the problem is that Elon Musk is not a sovereign state, so he doesn't have the wherewithal to formally declare anything like that. He is if he's going to fly to Mars, that's of course another question, whether that happens anytime soon. Probably you should ask a lawyer, although I have my own estimate on that. I don't think that's going to realistically happen, within the next 10 or 20 years, and maybe not. Maybe it will take much longer. The moon is a totally different ballgame, as you already indicated. But let's suppose that 50 years from now it will nevertheless happen. Then it still will happen under the authority of the United States as a state. And I cannot imagine that they will just tell Elon Musk, you go ahead, you name yourself king of a Martian settlement or whatever he's gonna apply to that. And then that solves the issue. Where he is right, of course, is that when we imagine, and that applies to the moon as well, that's why it's more relevant than you probably think if you just talk about Mars. Where it's relevant is that we do see, or we will see, if there will be human settlements on the moon after some time. I'm thinking about a few decades at least, but after some, maybe a little bit shorter, but certainly not the first few years, there will be among the people living on the moon an idea on, well, we should solve our own issues here, right? We should no longer call home to our mother state when we have a legal problem here. We should try to solve it on ourselves. So that there will be some form of self-governance arising um, will, I guess, be inevitable. And there, in that sense, he's right. It does require, however, for that to really take hold, for the states on Earth to accept that one way or another. And as long as he's an American citizen and flies there on an American registered spacecraft under a US license, and as long as the United States is still going to be responsible and liable for what happens there, they will probably not allow him to sit in judgment. That's not what he said. Of course, he's calling for a self-governing institution, but still, whoever undertakes these activities on the moon will initially face resistance from, I'm pretty sure, countries like the United States and others. Just like if you want to make the terrestrial comparison, when the Pilgrim Fathers on the northwestern shores of the Atlantic Ocean wanted to secede from the United Kingdom, their motherland, because they didn't like the king anymore and certainly didn't like being taxed by him. Initially, the British king didn't want to accept that, so there was a kind of a war of independence before the Brits said, "Okay, now you're out on your own." So I do think that these developments will happen in the end, also on Mars, if we ever get to settle there. The point I'm making is that Elon Musk cannot do that without being properly supervised and licensed by the United States, and at some point, the United States and maybe other countries involved as well will have to agree to that.
So, can I ask a question about that? And perhaps that will actually lead us to directly to the moon as well. I mean, there is an interesting tension, right? Because and you're going to talk about the Outerspace Treaty as well, where we are also saying that no country, no nation can own the territory.
Right.
But also, we are saying that, well, whoever goes there, it's tied to the earth in some sense, because that whichever nation has launched or given permission to go there. And so, I mean, is there a tension, or in the sense that if I want to be independent, I mean, in theory, space would be different because of the outer space treaty, that no one can own it. But on the other hand, we are also extending the territorial laws, as this example is. So either we think about it that the question of somebody getting independence is just identical to the earth, the way as you also described, or I mean, so is there anything that would be different because of outer space treaty, or is it?
Yes. I mean, I made the comparison with Earth because that is in some respects helpful, but we should always be very careful. And there are a couple of major differences between the Earth and outer space. One of them being, of course, that when the British settlers landed on the North American continent, there were already, for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, indigenous people living there. It was just that they were not recognized by the Western standards as being civilized people, which sort of presumably legitimized the Brits, and I must say my own country, the Dutch, and other European countries were equally guilty of that in other parts of the world, considered themselves entitled to occupy those territories and put a flag there and then rule over the indigenous people. Now, that is, of course, a crucial difference when it comes to outer space. There are no indigenous people in outer space, so at least not on the moon or Mars. So we don't have that problem. At the same time, and that's the interesting thing that you almost refer to, the Outer Space Treaty has this Article 2, which specifically prohibits the legal colonization of the moon. And the reason for that goes back to the fear of extending the old colonial wars and competition, the race between Western European countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia to compete for interesting colonies for an economic perspective, the fear that that might also happen in outer space gave rise to basically the United States and Soviet Union agreeing in the Outerspace Treaty that's not going to happen in outer space. So that's why Article 2 precludes the extension of territorial sovereignty over any part of outer space. I think that's a good thing. But now we are faced with a new situation in our hypothetical, which we just discussed. Not that there will be an effort of the United States to say wherever Elon Musk lands, that will become US territory, because that's clearly a no-go area. That's what Article 2 was meant to prevent. And the United States has always honored that. Even when the US astronauts planted their US flags on the moon, they made it abundantly clear that they came for all humankind. And we're not trying to claim that the moon, just by planting the flag there or by landing there, would become part of the United States. So they have been pretty good at keeping that approach. And so far, other countries have also been like that. But that still assumes that the danger is for terrestrial countries to capture part of outer space. The scenario we are talking about is rather that we have a population which becomes kind of indigenous. After 20 years of living on the moon, you might perhaps call yourself indigenous population, and then says to the Americans or to the Chinese government or the Russian government or wherever they come from, we don't recognize you anymore. So that's, in that sense, there is a difference. And in that sense, we might have to reassess the obligation of Article 2 to only refer to terrestrial states, so that the legal concept of a new state being exclusively based on lunar territory, by maybe resulting in the end from the self-governance idea that Elon Musk promoted, that might be something which changes the discussion. But it still requires, technically speaking, the consent of the terrestrial states to make that happen. If nobody recognizes a lunar state, it becomes a little bit similar to Taiwan, which for all practical purposes looks like a state, but because of political connotations is only recognized as such by a handful of other states.
This is such a fascinating topic, and unfortunately, we have to talk about it through the Musk lens. But I think it's just a really
Oh, yes.
theoretically, it's a really interesting thing. So,
He's great
yeah,
in putting these things on the table, at least, right? Whether
right,
he's right
yes,
or not is another question, but at least he forces us to think about these things much more thoroughly.
I think that's true. So, if we come to the directly on the moon, and of course, the big question is the ownership, and you have referred to it. So, if you can just briefly explain, that today, since US astronauts are also planning on going, and I'm going to talk about Artemis right after that. So, what is the status of, if you ask the question, well, who owns the moon? How do you describe it?
Yeah, well, if you look at the question at its most simple, the answer is all humanity. Um, Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty is again very clear in that. The problem with Article 2, looking forward to what we are seeing now, is that it only has this general statement about the moon as an area, or parts of the moon as an area, because at the time in 1967, nobody thought about A, permanent settlements, and B, the need then to start harvesting local resources. Because it's, if you want to really be there as a human settlement for a long time, you can't continuously bring everything you need from Earth, because that's much too expensive. So you need to find as much as possible locally and mine that. And since in 1967, when the Outer Space Treaty was drafted, nobody thought about the possibility for permanent settlement. It was only about the race to the moon and who gets there first and who brings back some stones for research and science investigation. We are now stuck with the question, what does it mean that no country can own part of the moon? Does it mean that they can also consequently not own the resources of the moon? or dictate who is entitled to own them? Or does it mean that it's comparable to the high seas, for example, which can also not be owned by any single country, but everyone is entitled to go there and fish and make money with earning the fish, as long as you comply with certain rules? So that's the discussion we are currently now in, that some countries say because the moon belongs to all humankind, that also means that everything which is in the moon, water, platinum, other valuable materials, that everything which is in the moon belongs to all humankind. So it cannot be harvested by a single country or by a private company licensed by a single country, read the United States. We need an international regime to allow for any potential exportation. And opposed to that, there's the interpretation, which, as you can understand, the United States certainly adheres to, is saying, well, no, it's like the high seas, right? So as long as we comply with whatever law is applicable, we can unilaterally harvest those resources.
So that brings me and again, I want to come back to Artemis in a second, but that brings me to President Obama's sort of a Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015,
Yes.
because that sort of like, allowed that space resources to be the property of any US citizen who manages to extract them, right? Like, that, okay, so you cannot own it, but if you are extracting them,
Yes.
you can keep it. And then, in sort of like tandem to that, NASA in 2021 gave a contract to this company, Lunar Outpost, for 10 cents as a down payment to take out some soil and move the regolith from one place to another. And then they are going to give it 90 more cents once the contract is over to show that it can be done. So, what's going on? Because to me, this is like, I mean, so there are two questions. One about the legality of this particular aspect in light of Outer Space Treaty, but also this ownership question become really complicated, because what if I put that soil with regolith that I own on top of the moon, and so do I own that space, that place where the regolith is been put extracted?
Those are great questions, and to be honest, they cannot be definitely answered yet. To go back to the first question, it's clear that the U.S. Assumes that this is legitimate. The law of 2015 that you mentioned, as well as the act of NASA to do that, is symbolic of their belief that this is legitimate. Um, I must say I agree with them, but to be, fair and objective, that is an interpretation going back to the general idea that indeed the fact that you do not own the moon as a whole doesn't keep you from owning resources once extracted. That is something which is even recognized by the Moon Agreement, which in other respects basically failed, which makes a distinction between the resources in situ, in their own place, and once they are extracted. So that's also where the comparison comes with the law of the sea. But in all fairness, not everyone agrees. So you could say that the action of NASA is following onto the US president's announcement in 2015 of the general legality of this, and seeing whether there is profound, widespread, and legally based arguments against that. And I don't see that much happening in that sense. We talked about the US Act. Since then, there have already been three countries with similar acts: Luxembourg, the United Arab Emirates, and Japan. So at least those three countries are basically also of the same opinion, that the fact that you can't own the moon as such doesn't keep you from perhaps, legitimate mining and then owning whatever you mined. Um, and we will talk about the Artemis Accords later, but that's also proof of more countries leaning towards that interpretation. There are still some who oppose that. Although, again, I'm not impartial in that sense, but I have not heard any convincing argument. The country which was most vociferously opposed to that was Russia. But interestingly enough, the Russians have also sold stuff from the moon to interested persons. So as if you sell something, it means you own it, right? So that suggests to me that they are not entirely true to their own words. And if you talk about not owning a particular area, it's been the Russians who planted a Russian flag on the North Pole, so many waters under the ice. So again, I think it's fair to say that increasingly states are seeing the US opinion and the US implementation as the most appropriate one, even if many of them are, and perhaps rightly so, concerned that if you just allow the United States or other companies or other countries to go there and mine, that there will be a big mess, that there will be conflicts, that there will be pollution of the environment, that, for example, Neil Armstrong's footsteps will be destroyed, which is, of course, what NASA is worried about. So it's not like everything is then good and well. We still need, as an international community, to develop some more profound rules on how that works. I'm
So,
sorry, this is a long story, but it's a very complicated issue, and I want to make clear to the listeners and the viewers that this is not finally solved, and that's also why it's interesting to see that the president in the same act is required to try and promote the U.S. position on the international level. Yesterday, I did an interview with a U.S. radio show, and the presentator asked me, "Well, what should a U.S. company care what the rest of the world thinks? As long as he gets a U.S. license, as long as what he does is legal under U.S. law, he's in business, right?" I said, "Nah, that's not entirely true, because you should realize that before you are able to start mining something on the moon, that requires an investment of billions. So you're only going to do that if you are maximizing your potential markets, right? And if only the US would recognize the validity of this interpretation, you only have a market of 320 million people. And if you want to sell it elsewhere, most likely the other states will say something like, to me, this is illegal because I didn't sign up to the US interpretation. To me, that is comparable to blood diamonds. I'm not allowing you to sell it to me. Probably I even try to seize the stuff as illegal contraband, right? So if you really want the world as your market, you need to convince the rest of the countries, or at least the major ones, to go along with this interpretation. And that's why the US president is trying to, or the US government is trying to convince the rest of the world that this is the appropriate approach. That's why also the Artemis Accords are playing a role. Over to you.
yeah, I'm still holding off. It's like, one of those cliffhangers, suspense. I'm gonna just take one more minute, but I'm still curious. What would be, so if you get a company, and it puts the extract onto
Right.
the surface, right? Does
No, you
does
cannot.
that
No,
place?
no.
No.
You still cannot own under Article 2. No country can own it. No country can own the place. And because no country can own the place, that also means that no private operator can own the place. There has been a US guy in 1980 who, thought he was smart. He read the Outerspace Treaty a couple of times and noticed that Article 2 talks about the prohibition of national appropriation. And he argued, I'm not a nation, so I'm not prohibited from appropriating him. But the point is that he used a US law applicable to how private persons under US law can obtain ownership over a piece of land. And the point is that US law doesn't apply to the moon because the moon is not the United States.
Right. And
So,
even here also, the government still owns the place, right? Even if you own it, the territory
sure. But if the government,
ultimately.
if it would be part of the United States, then of course the United States can say, okay, we allow a private citizen under the following circumstances and following the following procedures and protocols to obtain ownership. When it comes to land in the United States, that's perfectly legitimate. Just like in my country, in the Netherlands, we have different laws about how I can buy a house and a garden, and they're different again from India or Pakistan or Japan or whatever country. And none of those laws apply to outer space. That's the point. So that's why when a company tries to own a place, they cannot own the place.
Great. So now let's get to the Artemis Accord. So, so of course, Artemis Accord is, in some sense, we are talking about it because that is, in some sense, establishing what the interpretations to a certain degree of outer space,
Yeah.
or the practical applications of outer space treaty are going to be, because outer space treaty everybody agreed on, but it was also vague.
Yes.
How do you see Artemis Accords playing? And if I know, I think the current count is about close to 30 countries, I think,
Hmm.
have signed it. Notably, of course, China and Russia are not part of the Artemis Accord, and I'll come back to it because they have their own alliance
Yeah.
in there. So, how do you see Artemis Accord playing a role in these kind of questions?
Well, an important role because it's as I already sort of alluded to. It's kind of in extension of this requirement from the which the U.S. law requires the U.S. government to try and promote the interests of the U.S. industry, which is essentially seen as allowing. One country to license its own private operators to do so. And by creating the Artemis Accords, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're going to cooperate in a multi-billion-dollar project like Artemis, putting the first woman on the moon, trying to establish permanent habitation, multicultural, and stuff like that, you need to have some basic sense of agreement on the principles of how you run that settlement. And so it's perfectly logical that you as in the US, you tell other countries if you want to join the group, join the club, here's what we think are the rules that the club should play along with, right? Because otherwise, if we start fighting about the rules, then the club will explode and nothing will happen. And since the US in practice is the leading country, that's precisely why Russia and China will never join as such. Um, there is this understanding that the US is dictating the Artemis Accords, that which strictly speaking is not true. At the same time, of course, the voice of of um, of the US in this discussion, of NASA in discussion, is by nature much more important than the voice of the Luxembourg Space Agency, for example. But it is really an effort to see to what extent in that context, to what extent are other states willing to accept these basic general principles, because as you already alluded to, the Artemis Accords also have something to say about the possibility to mine resources, while they at the same time recognize that there's no ownership over the territory as such. The US is moving carefully because it specifically states that the Artemis Accords are not a binding legal treaty. So by signing on to that, those 30 or whatever the number is countries do not officially recognize that this is the only valid interpretation. But of course, it becomes increasingly difficult to argue otherwise, uh, because it sounds a little bit hypocritical if you tell the Americans, well, we work with you on the assumption that that is legal, and then in another forum says, we don't think it's legal, right? That there is these inherent contradictions. So in that sense, it does tend to lead towards a conclusion that the more countries sign up to that, the larger the assumption is that this is the legitimate interpretation. Of course, then China and Russia are the elephants in the room, because if you have two major spacefaring countries like that fundamentally disagreeing, then you still have a problem. Now, the interesting issue is, and you were going to talk about the Russian Chinese efforts anyway, the interesting issue is what will they come up with? That they procedurally do not like to join the Artemis Accords because then they are junior partners, and again, it's the US leading all that. That's one thing. But if their approach is essentially the same, if also the Chinese and the Russians are saying, we are not going to wait for an international regime to tell us that we can actually mine the moon, then in terms of the substance, they're on the same page. So that's why it's going to be very interesting to see what their agreement will end up to in terms of substance.
Yeah, it's a little bit like sort of like G20, which just happened, and sort of like BRICS. That okay, so they're both similar type of things, but China is a much prominent role, plays a much prominent role in BRICS rather than in G20, and uh, so in that context, and I'm just curious because there are certain laws in the U.S. congressional laws that prevent for example, NASA to work with China.
Hmm.
So does it automatically exclude China from joining Artemis Accord? Even if China, I mean, theoretically, hypothetically, if China wants to join Artemis Accord, is it automatically excluded? Or Artemis Accords are framed in a way that, yeah, they can, but they won't work together.
I think I haven't looked into that matter, so it's an interesting question. I haven't looked in it because, of course, it is not really practically relevant for the foreseeable near future. But it is an interesting theoretical question. I think under the current status, um, it might probably be possible in theory, but as long as the congressional limitations to actual cooperation are in place, it doesn't mean much, right? I mean, the whole idea of signing up to the Artemis Accords is that you will then actually join the effort, that your engineers will work with the engineers of the other member states to send missions there, to build habitats, to do mining and stuff like that. And if each and every time that happens, the American engineers have to say, "Sorry, I can't talk to you about how I see myself mining or how we see ourselves mining that," then it doesn't work. So I think, in fact, it is precluded, um, if not already by law, then at least by the factual circumstances, it will be precluded unless there will be a fundamental change. But that doesn't, and that's why I made that point before. That doesn't exclude that the fundamental theoretical idea of, if state X is going to be the first to actually start mining a certain site, that would be allowable, that fundamental rule might not be accepted by China as well. Because I find it very interesting that already 5 years ago or 8 years ago, when this discussion started, the Russians were immediately out there blaming the United States. So this is the old imperialist US, which tries to conquer the universe on behalf of US private enterprise, it's stuff like that. So they were very clearly against the US approach, and still are, I guess. But the Chinese didn't say anything. They were sitting on the fence. Because what I'm afraid many people in the US do not probably realize is that when we talk about the first actual mining operations, it might well be the Chinese who get there first. And if they get there first and start mining, the US can't blame them for doing so without international consent, if the US itself has always claimed that you don't need international consent. You see what I'm saying? So that's why it's interesting to see where that's going in a substantive fashion, even though practical, it will be totally separated, and we still need to think about what that means if the US and the Chinese will land on the same spot or close to each other and start mining the same platinum field. That's where we need to be careful.
Well, so that, in fact, that is the place where I wanted to go. And even before mining, I mean, I was thinking, I mean, of course, the one of the precious resources is water.
Right.
That is water, ice water, which is a lot of it is on the polar regions, in particular the South Pole. And both China and the US right now are planning for the South
Yeah.
Pole. Of course, India and Japan, and they are all sort of like looking for that. But so I just wanted to look at, sort of like, from a practical scenario purposes perspective. So the US is most likely going to send humans before China will, to back to the moon in the next
Okay.
couple of years.
I'm not so certain, but okay,
Oh,
let's see.
okay. All right.
I mean, we don't know what the Chinese
That's
are.
true.
They are not as transparent and as
That's true.
open as we are in the West. And in back in history, the Soviet Union was always great in only announcing a space flight after it was clearly a success, right?
Ah,
So we don't know, but anyway,
good point. Yeah. So if so let's assume, sort of like, no, US is there and they get a head start in terms of the lunar settlement.
right,
And obviously, and already, because of the openness, we actually know, for example, Shackleton crater or around that area on the lunar South Pole, that's where the US is planning. And of course, the reason is because there is a closer access to water ice, and there are other missions that are going, including the Chinese missions, that are trying to figure out which is the best place for water ice.
right.
Now, it's plausible that there are not that many places which are suitable for both landing and water ice and suitable for a lunar settlement. So, if the US gets for Artemis Accord countries, or Project Artemis goes first, and it lands there and creates a footprint, right? Like, whatever that footprint is. And then Chinese alliance, or China sends its program, and they want to have their uh, base over there. How will that play out in the context that, I mean, you can decide a footprint, big or small, and you of course want to leave the ability to grow little. You don't want the sort of like, the minimum one. You're going to say, okay, well, this is the place we are coming in. Of course, space weapons or weapons are not allowed over there, but you are going to say, well, this is my territory, even though you cannot own it. So how is that potentially is going to play out when you cannot own it, but the resources are limited, and there is a good chance that you will be pretty much next to each other, but one will be before the other?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and that's exactly why we hopefully need to arrive at some form of agreement on how that works. Because the answer is we haven't arranged for that yet. If you go again back to the Artemis Accords, it gives a first sort of, it puts the issue on the table through the concept of the safety zone, right? Artemis Accords, one of the most contentious issues is that the idea is that you create around a mining site a safety zone. Um, and while the concept of a safety zone as such makes a lot of sense, we know on the oceans that there are safety zones around oil platforms, which basically means that if you intend to come within that zone, which is, I believe, 500 meters or something like that, it's not very large, you're supposed to inform the ones running the oil rig, because they need to tell you, well, don't do this, don't do that, because otherwise security and safety of everyone concerned will be endangered. So you can certainly imagine that in theory, the concept of a safety zone is very logical also around an installation on the moon. You don't want foreigners blundering in and destroying everything, and then in the moon also putting human risks at life of whoever's there. But of course, what we still have no clarity on is how far does a safety zone extend? If you just think about hypothetically, I would say maybe a kilometer or maybe 2 kilometers makes sense. Um, if you talk about 200 kilometers, that doesn't make sense. And that sounds like using the safety zone as a ruse to actually tell everyone else, stay out of there. Whatever you find in there is mine, and I'm going to mine it. So, to your question, we have to somewhere in between there come to some sort of general agreement. Once you have a mining site on the moon, this is the extent to which you can actually claim that you are the one entitled to mine that part without owning it, which is a big question. So there might be still a need for an international authority which sort of says, okay, you get this for 25 years, and then afterwards we'll see. But we don't have anything like that for the moon, right?
So I mean, are we talking about a potential, not a United Nations, because United Nations has all other issues in terms
Right,
of
right.
dysfunctionality, but a space, or I mean, of course, UN also has space links as well. But I'm just thinking, sort of like, a similar kind of sort of like transnational
Right,
organization
right.
that can very specifically address these type of things,
Yeah.
which will be coming up.
As an academic, I would say that would be the most, the most fair solution in view of the fact that the moon belongs to everyone. Uh, Unfortunately, the closest thing we have to something like that is the International Telecommunication Union, which is part of the UN family, which makes sure that everyone uses or tries to make sure that everyone uses the orbits and the frequencies in a way so as not to interfere with each other. Now, of course, that comparison only goes so far. The ITU, uh, we say the ITU arranges that. In reality, it's the combination of member states, because the ITU is not supranational, it's intergovernmental. So ultimately, it still depends upon the member states to recognize whatever happens in the ITU. And increasingly, we see sometimes problems coming up. A couple of years ago, there was interference with a European satellite, which was perfectly gone through all the ITU mechanisms, so perfectly legitimate. It was interfered with from Iranian territory, because the Iranians didn't like the broadcast that Eutelsat was broadcasting, including over Iranian territory. That was illegal, and it was, basically proven that it came from Iran. Yet Iran denied, and nobody could hold Iran in any way practically accountable. So it only goes so far. And another problem with the comparison to the moon is that in the context of the use of radio frequencies, there is this lucky thing called the laws of physics, which mean that if you interfere with someone else, that someone else automatically interferes with you. So everyone has an inherent interest in finding frequencies where they do not get into each other's hair. On the moon, it doesn't work that way. If you manage to get the biggest site, you may interfere with somebody else's operations or somebody else's interests, but they may not be able to bother you. So I'm afraid, honestly, that is not a realistic solution. So being less ambitious, I can only hope that China, United States, Japan, leading Western European countries, Russia, maybe countries like Brazil and India and Indonesia would come to some sort of understanding, and this is kind of the limitation of what we're at. Let's, for the sake of avoiding conflicts, all agree, that we don't build mining sites closer than 5 kilometers apart. And I'm just quoting a number off the top of my head, right? But we are certainly not there yet.
Yeah, and by the way, one party that so I'm trained as an astronomer. So
Yeah,
one of the things in terms of the satellite or the frequencies,
yeah.
astronomers are the ones who complain about sort of like, hey, those are actually important communication, sort of like things
Listen to
for
black holes
astronomy.
and,
Yeah, exactly,
dying
exactly.
stars and supernovas and stuff. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so one other question regarding this before we move on, and that is about, I mean, of course, the militarization,
Hmm.
right? I mean, like that, and that a little bit ties into this question of safety zones. I mean, obviously, when we are talking about safety zones, we are not, in theory, at least right now, we're not talking about people with guns and things like that. Nevertheless, the conflicts potentially are going to arise because we are humans. We have a pretty long history of saying that. And then, of course, the US, and we don't know the Chinese and Russian sort of like, context in there, but US as more officially has a space force and so on and so forth. And I know that there are laws against nuclear weapons, but I don't know what the sort of like non or sort of like non-nuclear weapons or the militarization of space. How will that show up on the moon? Is there a loophole? Is there room for that, or is it really demilitarized zone?
No, it is the latter. I mean, first of all, we should distinguish between militarization and weaponization. Militarization has been the case in space from the beginning.
Right.
I mean, the whole space race between the United States and Soviet Union was for a large part about technology which they could also use for nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and beyond that, it was, of course, for prestige purposes as well. And from the get-go, the technology had dual use implications and all that stuff. I mean, it's not accidental that the first generations, plural, of astronauts and cosmonauts on the Russian side, on the Soviet side, were all people from the Air Force or the Navy Air Force or the Army, right? So they were all military personnel. So militarization, if people try to argue that space should not be militarized, well, here's a secret: it's been militarized since 1957, right?
Right.
Weaponization is a totally different matter. And there we luckily have a distinction between the celestial bodies and the void of outer space. And the reference to weapons of mass destruction that you made only applies to the void of outer space. So the only limitation when it comes to the void of outer space in terms of weaponization is that you're not supposed to hang weapons of mass destruction there, to orbit them or to station them. So as a lawyer, you should not only read what something says, but also what something does not say. So this rule does not say two things. It does not prohibit the use of outer space as a trajectory for nuclear weapons. It only prohibits to station them there. And that is logical because think for a moment, neither the Soviet Union nor the United States would have signed up to a treaty which prohibited them from using intercontinental ballistic missiles in a case of a Third World War, because that was such a key component of their national security. So that is not prohibited. And the other thing which is not prohibited is stationing weapons that are not of a mass destruction nature in outer space. You may recall that in the 1980s, the Reagan administration in the US was thinking with this idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars, and the idea was to hang a lot of laser beam weapons up there in order to prevent the Russians from being able to hit the United States. And the whole question legally was, is a laser beam weapon a weapon of mass destruction or not? If it is, it would have been prohibited. If it was not, it would have been allowed. The question luckily remained moot because Star Wars never got off the drawing board, but that's kind of the situation. Now, the celestial bodies is a totally different animal, because there, as my initial answer indicated, we have total militarization. The only thing which is allowed is to use military personnel for peaceful purposes. But again, realize out of the 12 Americans that set foot on the moon, 11, were groomed as military personnel. So, but there is a total militarization, no maneuvers, no weapons, no military installations, etc., etc. And there even is, and this is also interesting in the context of the human settlements, there is a requirement under the Outerspace Treaty to allow representatives from other states to, under certain conditions, under certain circumstances, to visit your facilities so as to make themselves, aware, confident that there is no secret weapon hiding there.
So that's interesting. So that's very explicit, and it's like no weapons. So you cannot pick up and like gun or anything. So that would be a completely that I think that's better than I thought it would be. So that there is a glimmer of hope in this thing.
Absolutely.
So we're getting towards the end, and I wanted to ask a little bit about because if we have settlements over there, there would be crimes that may take place. There may be sort of like issues that may take place on the moon.
Everything,
Uh,
sex,
right,
making contracts, selling stuff,
right. So
everything.
how would that uh, be handled? Because jurisdictions, there are different jurisdictions. So I mean, on the just on the one hand, I mean, I can imagine sort of like this country where you originate or whatever, but you also have now, if you are a private contractor from space, I mean, you have multinational collaborations, multinational companies, collaborations, and then you are on the moon in a particular context, again within the Outer Space Treaty, that it is identified as a different type of territory. So how would law apply to cases, civil or criminal, on the moon?
That's a great question. I need to do a little bit of a theoretical preliminary there. If you talk about how laws apply, there are two universally recognized triggers, and it depends upon the formulation. So the one trigger is that it happens on your territory. Yeah? If you're a sovereign state, say the United States, then you can establish any laws that you want, unless there's certain morals or international obligations which go against that, who apply to everyone on the territory. I'm a Dutch citizen, but when I'm in the US, I have to comply with US laws, and if I do something which violates them, the US police can nick me up and put me before a court, and if I'm convicted, I go to prison. Um, that type of laws, the laws which say on the territory of the United States or in the United States, this or that is prohibited, or this or that is allowed or required, they cannot apply on the moon because the moon cannot be US territory. But there's another tool which is equally universally recognized for states to say that everyone with the US nationality, I take the US as an example, everyone with the US nationality, regardless of where that person is required to do X, Y, or Z. And since you do not lose your nationality just because you're in outer space, you remain an American. American laws that say every American citizen has to do this or that, or is prohibited from doing this or that, still falls under US law. So it depends upon how the laws are phrased. If the law on murder says everyone committing a murder in the United States can be brought before a US court and sentenced to death or to 20 years in jail or whatever. That law cannot apply to a murder on the moon. But if the law says every US citizen which commits a murder can be brought to justice, then that applies also to a murder on the moon. So
And
that,
that extends to, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that's the baseline. In addition, we have something called quasi-territorial jurisdiction, which we already know from flagships and flag aircraft, which have nationality. So if you're on board of a US ship, it is almost seen as a floating piece of US territory, and US laws can apply on board of the ship on a quasi-territorial basis. The same concept applies to registered space objects. So a US shuttle or even a Elon Musk vehicle, which becomes a US vehicle for this purpose of the law, can be made subject to US legislation applying on board. The problem is, of course, if it lands on the moon and then the people leave and build their own stuff and never go back to the original spacecraft, it only extends to the spacecraft and a little bit beyond that. So once you are longer on the moon, it might be problematic for the United States to still act as if you fall under your quasi-territorial jurisdiction, because you don't care about that spaceship which brought you there 20 years ago, and actually it may have left already 18 years ago back home. So these are the kind of scenarios that you have to think about. So that's where you then need to move to, going back to the very beginning of this talk, to the idea of Elon Musk, that you have some idea to develop your own regime there.
Yeah, and I'm just, when you were mentioning that and thinking about the maritime flags, sort of like, for ships as well, I was just thinking, I mean, so is it possible that you can have like Cayman Islands or others, sort of like, that, okay, so you can get a nationality which has looser
Requirements.
requirements, and you can go in there and you go like, okay, well, I'm a citizen of that, okay, well, those laws apply, but the US laws or whatever, like, laws don't apply. I mean, is that so? So there could be, because there could be an industry associated with
Yeah,
that. But
yeah. Well, that's the so-called flag state problem, right? The
yeah,
flag of convenience, which in the law of the sea is a major problem. Now, luckily speaking, in space, I mean, I'm not saying it's never going to happen. I'm sure some smart, devious people will find ways around this, but there are at least two factors which make me somewhat less worried for the time being when it comes to space compared to the maritime area. What you have to realize is that when it comes to licensing ships, and you do not require much in terms of safety procedures, or you don't require the captain to have a certificate showing that he knows how to pilot the ship and stuff like that. If then something bad happens, 95% of the time other countries will suffer, right? Because wherever the ship breaks up, that's where the disaster will be, that's where the environmental disaster will be, that's where the beaches will be flooded with oil and stuff like that. 95% of the time that will not be your own shore, because it happens somewhere else. In the context of space, the most dangerous part of the activity is the launch activity. If you allow someone to launch from your territory, and if something goes wrong, you are the country that suffers. So there is a practical limitation there, which hopefully at least will make every country consider, think three times before they allow someone to launch without proper licensing obligations. And then in addition, there's the legal beauty of space law, which holds states liable for any damage caused, even if the launch is private. So, and I don't want to pick on Elon Musk all the time, but if SpaceX crashes from Florida in Mexico and causes $1 billion of damage, the bill will first go to the United States government under international law. So it is up to the US government then to make sure that Elon Musk doesn't crash too many stuff in Mexico, that he knows what he's doing, and that he is required to repay under the license the US government what the US government has to pay to Mexico. And that he is actually also insured against that, so that it's not like, okay, my company is only worth $100 million, bad luck for the remaining 900. You know what I'm saying? So those two elements will caution states to be too quick in allowing, in serving as a flag state, as we know in the maritime era.
And this is the reason why, like the Starship, for example, I mean, with the next flight, there are requirements that the
Right.
US government is asking, have you taken those precautions? Because
Exactly.
they would be ready to launch, but the US say, have you taken that? So, okay,
Exactly.
I have two more questions, and then we'll end. One is about, do you think, when we were talking about the history of outer space treaty, you
Yeah.
mentioned about the threat of colonial, or not repeating the colonial history.
Right.
I'm just wondering that the way Artemis Accord and the Chinese-Russian alliance is shaping up. I mean, of course, there are some objections from some African countries. They also have brought up alternatives, but their voices are not heard because even if they have good suggestions, I mean, it's just because they are not players in it. So, in some sense, are we repeating the colonial history on a bigger scale now, but with a different lens? Because it's still a few countries that have the capacity, and what is being driven, because ultimately that's the history is going to be written by them for the next 100 years, for
Yeah.
example.
Well, the risk is certainly there. We shouldn't be kidding ourselves that everything automatically will be hunky dory in space. But there is also a little bit of hope because different from the old colonial age, which was really about white people from Western Europe, going to the rest of the world and acting as if they were entitled to occupy those and to own those pieces. We have a much more global approach. I mean, a couple of Arab countries have joined. I think that Nigeria is also one of the
Yeah.
countries which has joined the Artemis Accord, which is, of course, a leading African nation. So that doesn't automatically say that that the risk will not be going away, because also African countries, big African countries, may show power tendencies, imperialist tendencies. That's part of human nature, I'm afraid. But I'm hopeful that it will be at least a more global effort than the colonization effort, which was really about 6 or 7 countries from Western Europe, Netherlands, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, to a little bit of an extent, maybe Germany and Italy, and that was about it in terms of overseas classical colonialism, right?
Yeah. So so that's actually again a good sign. So if the last thing I would ask you is, and I know you wouldn't want to speculate, but so I don't want to put you in this, because as a lawyer, like, I don't want to put you in the speculation thing. But
I'm going to disclaim liability anyway, so don't worry.
but is there something that you are concerned about? What would be your biggest concern right now in terms of the way settlements on the moon are taking place? What
Well,
should we be worried about?
I am concerned. I mean, again, I'm not without entirely without hope, but it doesn't mean that there are serious risks, and the sort of the deterioration of the geopolitical situation, let's say over the last 8 to 10 years, is worrisome, because it certainly enlarges the possibility for conflict. If we talk about the moon specifically, there are a handful of powers which are zooming in on that. Some are more focused on their own national interest than others, perhaps. But of course, there is a little bit of a race going on, and races may lead to ruin, or at least to catastrophic incidents or accidents. So I'm certainly hoping, and whatever I can do as an academic or a consultant to help that going, is that we will be able to establish some rules of the road, even if it's not a treaty or something like that. That we understand that we're all in this together as humanity, and that at the end of the day, everyone would be worse off if we get these major conflicts there. But we should be realistic. I'm not sure that's sufficient to convince certain leaders to refrain from certain bad actions, right? I won't mention any names, but you know what I'm referring to, I'm sure.
By the way, have you seen For All Mankind, the show, TV show?
No, no.
Okay, all right, because it does sort of, like, it brings up some of these
Okay,
questions and things like that. So if you get a chance,
okay.
well, Professor, thank you so much. This was just such an enlightening conversation, and I just love. I mean, I know I'm also a little sort of, like, pessimistic, worried about sort of, like, how things are going to go,
Right, right.
but but academically, intellectually, it's such a fascinating
It is.
topic, and to imagine how things are going to play out, and hopefully in the next 10, 15 years we are going to be seeing some of those questions uh, play out and the questions that you have raised as well. So thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.